My name is Kylie Duberstein. I'm an associate professor at the University of Georgia and I teach in the animal science department. I'm also one of our horse extension specialists for the state of Georgia, and what that means is that I work to help people across the state answer questions and solve problems related to their horses. My PhD is in equine nutrition, and what we've put together is a 10-part series of videos on forage education for horse owners, and these are sponsored by the Georgia Equine Commodity Commission, and we're really excited to start these. Part 1 is going to be this video that we're going to do today, and what we're going to do is talk about the GI tract of the horse, the gastrointestinal tract, and why that allows them to eat forages like grass and hay. One of the first things that we need to talk about is that the horse is what we call a modified monogastric or a hindgut fermenter. This means that the horse only has a single stomach and it has a specialized compartment in its hindgut called the cecum where it digests fiber in the forage that it eats. What you see here is the GI tract as it sits in the horse. And if you follow food as it comes down the esophagus, it would enter the relatively small stomach of the horse. After that, food goes into the small intestine of the horse, which is very difficult to see because of the organs that surround it. If you were to peel back these organs, you would see about 70 feet of small intestine very tightly coiled, sort of in the middle of this GI tract. From the small intestine, food would leave and enter the cecum, or this structure that you see right here, this large pink structure, which is where the fermentation of food takes place that we'll talk about as we go through the slideshow today. After food leaves the cecum, it moves into the large colon, which wraps from the right side to the left side of the horse's body. The large colon then becomes the small colon, where fecal balls are formed and food exits the GI tract. If we look at this animal here, this is the GI tract of the horse, kind of simplified and stretched out so that you can see it easily. So if we follow the way food enters the GI tract, it comes in through the mouth after the horse has chewed it. It runs down through the very long esophagus. The esophagus ties into the stomach, and the angle of the esophagus and the tightness of a sphincter that's right here at the entrance of the stomach prevent the horse from being able to vomit. So you probably already knew that your horse couldn't vomit, but that's the reason why. Food then enters the relatively small and very acidic stomach, and from there it moves into the small intestine. And the small intestine has been simplified here and shortened. If we were to actually show the full length of this small intestine, it would be about 70 feet in length. And so it's very tightly coiled in the horse. This is where enzymatic digestion happens, so where the body's enzymes break down the food. So after food travels throughout the small intestine, it then enters what we call the hindgut of the horse, which begins with the cecum. The cecum is a blind sac that food goes in and stays for a period of several hours where the microbes ferment this food. And after it's been in here and fermented, it would leave and go into the large colon. The large colon and the following small colon really serve the main purpose of resorbing water. So not a lot of digestion happens in the hindgut beyond the cecum. So the large colon and small colon, their main role is to pull water back into the horse. And so if you compare the feces of the horse to other animals such as a cow, you'll notice that the feces are very well formed and a lot drier. This is because the large colon and small colon do a very good job of pulling that water back in. Digestion of food begins in the mouth. This is a very important and often overlooked step in digestion. The horse's teeth serve the very important function of reducing the particle size of the food so that the horse's body can more easily break it down. The horse has both incisors, which are these teeth in the front that the horse uses to bite off its food when grazing, and its molars, which are these teeth in the back that the horse uses to grind its food into smaller bites. It's important to notice that the upper jaw is slightly wider than the lower jaw. The horse has very long teeth that are folded up into the dental sockets. These teeth are continuously erupting or pushing their way out while the horse is continuously wearing them down by chewing on abrasive foods like grass and hay. Because the upper jaw is wider than the lower jaw, the molars don't wear evenly. Instead, the horse wears away the inside of the teeth of the upper jaw and the outside of the teeth in the lower jaw, which leaves sharp points where the molars don't come in contact with each other. This is why it's so important to have a dental exam done every year and have your veterinarian float the teeth and remove these sharp points. And many of our senior horses, their molars have worn away and they might not be able to break down forages to begin digestion. Many older horses with no teeth can probably glean some nutrients from grazing, but they have a very difficult time chewing hay. For these horses, it's important to provide forage replacers such as wet down alfalfa cubes, beet pulp, or hay stretchers. The other important thing to discuss about the mouth is that the horse produces saliva only in response to chewing. This small fact is critically important and shouldn't be overlooked because it plays a factor in many gastrointestinal problems. Saliva is important both to lubricate a food bolus as it passes through the GI tract, as well as to provide a buffer to neutralize stomach acid. Lack of lubrication can lead to things like impaction colic, and lack of buffering can lead to the formation of stomach ulcers. Serious health problems can arise from the horse not chewing or producing enough saliva. So again, chewing really serves that purpose of breaking down the food size into a more manageable particle size to travel through the GI tract, and also to provide enough lubrication for that food to make it through the GI tract without getting stuck somewhere. So choke is a problem that can happen if the horse bolts its food and doesn't chew well. The particle size isn't reduced enough and there's not enough saliva to push that food bolus down, so it gets trapped in the esophagus. Another problem that happens with our horses is impaction colic. And impaction colic is a blockage somewhere in the horse's intestine, oftentimes in the small intestine. And this is frequently caused by the horse, again, not chewing well, potentially eating a dry food and not producing enough saliva to help move that food bolus through the small intestine. So what happens is that food gets clogged or blocked somewhere, and the horse, the GI tract basically gets backed up because food won't continue flowing through the GI tract of the horse. We very rarely see impaction colics in horses that are out on pasture. And the reason for that is that the pasture is a very moist foodstuff in itself. So pasture is probably 70% water. If we compare that to something like hay, hay is only about 10% water, so it's a very dry foodstuff. So the horse really needs to chew better when it eats hay, and it needs to produce enough saliva to move that hay, that dry material, through the intestine of the horse. Some of our grasses, particularly Bermuda grass, are very fine stemmed. So sometimes you'll hear that Bermuda grass makes a horse more prone to colic. This has not really been proven scientifically in any study. There have been a few cases that have linked impaction colics to Bermuda grass, but there's been no really good study to compare grass species. However, if Bermuda grass potentially causes impaction colic or makes a horse more prone to impaction colic, it's probably due to the fact that it's very fine stemmed. And if a fine stemmed variety, it might make some horses bolt it quicker and not chew it as well and produce saliva. So again, that would be associated mainly with hay, not fresh forage, and it would be associated with a lack of chewing to produce enough saliva to move that food bolus through the gut of the horse. When we look at the time of year that impaction colics happen, they frequently happen in the winter, And the reason for this is that horses often don't drink well in the winter. So when it gets cold outside, there's snow on the ground, the water is fairly iced over, or at least cold for them to stick their noses in, horses get a lot less inclined to drink. They also don't have fresh pasture, so they're often eating hay. And so this just sets up a scenario where the horse is eating a much drier foodstuff. Sometimes if they're out eating a round bale, they might be eating ad libitum, so eating as much as they want, without being encouraged to drink. So there are a lot of management strategies that we can do to help prevent this. One of them would be to make sure you transition your horse to a drier feedstuff like hay before it gets really cold so that they don't go out and gorge themselves on a round bale. Another would be to make sure that your water is warm to an ambient temperature so that they want to put their noses in it and drink. And then another simple solution might be to add a tablespoon or so of salt to their feed on a cold night to encourage them to drink. The other important function that I mentioned that saliva has to the horse is that it acts as a buffer to neutralize the stomach acid that the horse produces. So with every bite that the horse chews and swallows, it's swallowing a large amount of sodium bicarbonate, which acts to neutralize that acid in the stomach. The horse is designed to be a continuous eater, and that's something that we oftentimes forget when we manage, especially when we manage our stalled horses. So if left on its own, the horse would eat voluntarily probably 16 or more hours a day. What this means is that there is always a presence of food moving through the GI tract. The horse has a lot of adaptations to deal with food moving continuously through its gut. So an example of this would be that the horse does not have a gallbladder. You and I produce bile in our liver, but then that bile is stored in the gallbladder and it's released into the small intestine in the presence of food so that it can help to break down the fat. Horses are able to digest fat in their diet. They do a very good job of digesting fat in spite of the fact that they don't have a gallbladder. And the reason for this is that they have a liver that is positioned directly above the small intestine, and that liver is continuously secreting bile into the small intestine to aid with the digestion of fat. So this is just one example of the way that the horse has evolved to basically deal with the continuous flow of food through its gut. The other adaptation that the horse has is that it continuously secretes stomach acid, regardless of whether there's food in the stomach or not. This acid aids in breaking down food, but extreme acidity can lead to stomach ulcers. If the horse is eating as it should, it would continuously produce and swallow saliva, which is composed of sodium bicarbonate and acts to neutralize the acidity in the stomach. If you think of what the horse eats and how long it takes, a grain meal is eaten very quickly, so the amount of chewing and saliva produced wouldn't buffer for very long. It's the forage that the horse eats that enables it to buffer its stomach contents for an extended period of time. If the horse is eating as it would in nature, it would be eating for much of the day and would therefore be buffering its stomach contents by chewing and producing saliva fairly continuously. However, if you think of many stalled horses, they're often fed only a flake or two of hay in the morning and another flake or two at night. If the flakes are small, the horse spends a lot of the day not eating, with its stomach still producing acid that isn't being neutralized. This is why it's so important that the horse's diet be based around adequate forage intake. The horse eats about 2% of its body weight a day in dry matter. For a 1,000-pound horse, this is roughly 20 pounds of dry matter. Food is never entirely dry matter. Fresh grass is about 25 to 30% dry matter, while hay is about 90% dry matter. So if a horse is eating 2% of its body weight a day in hay, it would be eating roughly 22 pounds of hay a day. As the horse eats more grain, it will reduce its forage intake to where the total dry matter intake is still about 2% of its body weight. A very important nutritional guideline is to never feed your horse less than 1% of its body weight on a dry matter basis in forage per day. For a 1,000-pound horse, this is roughly 12 pounds of hay if it's not eating any other forage source. Feeding less than this can lead to GI upset like ulcers and colic. When we examine what the horse eats, it's important to know that the horse's feed, both the grain and the forage, is made up of carbohydrates, proteins, fats, vitamins, minerals, and water. When we look at the carbohydrate portion, it can be broken down into two categories: sugars and starches, and fiber. The main difference between these is the way and the place that they are digested. The small intestine of the horse is where it has many enzymes to digest and absorb fats, proteins, vitamins, minerals, and the sugars and starches. Basically, everything except the fiber. Fiber is digested in the hindgut and the cecum. Fiber is a bit of a generic term, and it can encompass different things, but we're often referring to something called cellulose when we talk about fiber. If we look at the difference between sugars, starches, and cellulose, that difference lies in the structure. Sugars are simple units of glucose, lactose, or galactose that the body absorbs in the small intestine. Starches and cellulose are long chains of glucose molecules. The difference between them is the bond that links them. Starches are linked by an alpha bond that you can see here, while cellulose is linked by a beta bond, as you see down below. The enzymes in the small intestine can break down the alpha bond in starch, but they can't break down the beta bond in cellulose. That means that fiber in the horse's diet can't get broken down and absorbed in the small intestine. It goes to the cecum of the horse to be fermented. If we were to look into the cecum of the horse, we would notice that there are a lot of microbes, which are things like microscopic bacteria, and these ferment the fiber that the horse eats and release end products that the horse can use for energy. However, the horse is different from another fermenting animal, the cow, in that the process in the horse happens towards the end of the digestive tract, where in a cow or other ruminant species, it happens at the beginning. Also, the fermentation chamber in a ruminant animal is much larger than that of a horse. What this means is that the amount of time that the horse is able to ferment fiber is considerably less than the amount of time spent by a cow fermenting fiber. For this reason, the horse is less efficient at digesting fiber as compared to a cow and must be given a higher quality forage than can sometimes be utilized by our ruminant animals. It's also important to understand that forage is not just fiber. Forage, by definition, is higher in fiber than other feeds that we might give the horse. Horses need this fiber and forage to maintain their gut health. It helps promote gut motility, which moves food through the GI tract. It promotes chewing, which neutralizes stomach acid, and it promotes the growth and colonization of a stable gut microbiome, or good bacteria in the gut. However, the horse gets more than just fiber from forage. Forage also has simple carbohydrates like sugars and starch. It has protein. It has vitamins. It has minerals. And of course, it has water. Forage quality relates to the abundance and digestibility of all of these nutrients. And the hope of this video series is to give you more education on how to select and manage the forage in your horse's diet. Thanks for joining us for part 1 of our forage education videos for horse owners. Now that you have some basic information on the horse's unique digestive tract and needs, please continue to check out our videos on forage education sponsored by the Georgia Equine Commodity Commission.